So we finally know exactly what went wrong with Highguard thanks to a report from investigative journalist Jason Schreier. Now, for those wondering about the current state of Highguard, it's looking incredibly bleak, with the game's all-time peak being at almost 100,000 players, but since launch, we're seeing only triple digits, with the 24-hour peak as of the recording of this video sitting at a mere 551 players. Nowhere near enough to run a live service, and much less to financially maintain it, as this is a free-to-play live service that requires recurrent monetization to support it. With Highguard, we're seeing nowhere near sufficient numbers. The reviews are still mixed even after all this time, sitting at a 46% on Steam. Even critic reviews are sitting at a mixed score of 63%. So it's not just about some hate train, right? There are just things that are genuinely off about Highguard, despite its valiant attempt. As I've said before, it's nowhere near as bad as the internet initially made it out to be, but it's also nowhere near as good as the people overinflating it made it out to be either. And despite the release of a 5v5 mode, that wasn't enough to revive the game. And the fact that most of Wildlight was laid off almost 2 weeks after launch is not a good indication of a thriving live service. This live service is dead. Its fate is sealed as far as I'm concerned. I don't really see it making a comeback. With that said, let's check out this article from news outlet Bloomberg from none other than Jason Schreier, titled "The Story Behind the Failure of Highguard." And there's nothing here that's terribly shocking, if you ask me, but it's still good to know exactly what went on behind the scenes so that we can have a cautionary tale for future developers. This is information that comes from 10 former Wildlight employees who decided to share what their experience was like developing this game. It all started in 2021 when developers from Respawn decided that they wanted to quit the typical AAA publisher structure under EA's purview and essentially find the freedom of the pre-EA days. So they formed Wildlight. And also, they were kind of mad that when Apex Legends launched, despite how much money that game made, the creatives who worked on the title, they just felt that they weren't, quote, benefiting enough from the resulting windfall. And so the whole point of Wildlight was to try to replicate that success with all of the developers' experience and have a profit-sharing program where if they shipped another massive success, everyone would benefit. And that actually ended up attracting a lot of talent from Respawn. And then along the way, they managed to secure some funding from Tencent, and that's when they finally started to develop this new game that initially was inspired by survival titles like Rust, where you could invade enemy bases and whatnot. And so they initially wanted to make a survival-focused shooter, but because of the open world, mass freedom nature of survival games, it just didn't align with the competitive play that they were also aiming for. 2 years into development, they realized this concept just wasn't working, but they did salvage aspects of it, like the base rating component that the final game features. It wasn't until January 2024 that development shifted towards the Highguard that we know today, where they finally locked in on exactly what kind of game they wanted to make. That's when they came up with this raid shooter concept that had aspects of survival games and base rating and whatnot in an environment that could pave the road to a faster, more competitive gameplay style. They also played around with multiple types of team compositions. They apparently experimented with 4 teams of 3 players each. I even heard they previously had experimented with 5v5 and whatnot, but they eventually landed on 3v3 matches as the foundation of the game. And that right there would be one of their biggest mistakes. It would be one of the most criticized aspects of the game, so much so that they had to rush out a 5v5 mode to try to salvage a player base that was very quickly diminishing shortly after the game's launch. 3v3 felt very focused, but it just didn't feel very fun because the maps were too big for a 3v3 mode, where it felt like, especially during the looting phase before raiding bases, you just really hardly ever encountered other players. So that half of the game during a match just felt really boring. But the developers felt very confident because internal tests all showed very positive results. But what a lot of former developers highlight is that these internal tests had blind spots. And that's something that I speculated when that one developer who blamed gamers and creators spoke out and talked about how, the game we were making, we did internal tests and the feedback seemed really positive. I talked about how unreliable internal tests can be because the conditions of that are not really the same as when you finally launch a game to the masses. I've seen multiple occasions of internal tests not matching up with a final result. And so I've always said, do not fully rely on that, especially if you're shipping a brand new IP as a live service in this oversaturated market. Bloomberg's article highlights right here how, based on what their sources said, there were blind spots in the process of internal playtesting. The game was complicated to learn. It was more fun when using voice chat, but as soon as you turn off the microphones, it made for a much worse experience. And not to mention that during internal tests and events, having developers on hand to answer questions and explain mechanics also led to different conditions than players would ultimately face when the game was released to the wild. And apparently when developers brought up to leadership that maybe they should do a playtest, a beta or something, and get player feedback before fully releasing the game, those proposals were always turned down by leadership, which is just baffling to me. It takes a very high level of confidence to operate in that way, but if the end results don't match the confidence, what you ultimately get is hubris. And that's a word that was mentioned by developers. I'll get to that in a bit. The leadership at Wildlight believed that because they worked at Respawn and had shipped massively successful titles, that they could kind of try to replicate what they did with Apex Legends. And that was very much the intent. Sources report in this article that they basically tried to repeat what they did with Titanfall as well as with Apex Legends. With Titanfall, they shipped a multiplayer-only game, and then with Titanfall 2, they shipped a single-player campaign alongside multiplayer. And so the goal was to eventually develop a single-player campaign for Highguard. And then beyond that, with the Apex Legends side of things, that game was one that was shadow dropped and still achieved massive success due to the element of surprise. And that's what developers were hoping for with Highguard. But then that plan was ruined when they decided to showcase it at the Game Awards as the big finale. And so the shadow drop element went out the window. And also, Apex Legends has the backing of the fact that it was developed by Respawn, whereas Wildlight is still a brand new studio making a brand new IP, both of which are completely unproven. And to try to pursue the Apex route, I think was just a huge mistake and something that came from a place of high self-importance. One that gave them a lot of misplaced confidence, and all of the internal playtests seemed really positive. So they were ready to announce this thing and to show it to the world. But then, the Game Awards thing happened. The feedback was overwhelmingly negative. And so they had to go quiet and incognito in the hopes that when the game launches, it would speak for itself. And the thing is, the game did speak for itself because while the game launched to almost 100,000 concurrent players on Steam, and Bloomberg reports that there were similar numbers across PlayStation and Xbox, so a pretty big launch, a lot of players just didn't stay due to the flawed execution of this ambitious concept. Bloomberg highlights how reviewers criticized a number of elements, the fact that 3v3 wasn't big enough for how large the maps were, tedious mechanics such as mining, which are remnants of earlier versions of Highguard that focused more on survival, combined with complicated aspects that made it less fun to play if you're playing with strangers and microphones weren't on. And as Bloomberg aptly highlights right here, these are all things that could have been identified if they had just done a playtest. If they would have foregone their hubris and instead done this process properly with a live service like this, so much could have been figured out and salvaged if they had just allowed people to provide feedback and if they had made proper changes prior to the big launch. So yeah, the end result was that in 24 hours, the game lost over 80% of its players. A week later, it lost roughly 90% of its players. Fast forward to today, and the concurrent players has dipped so much that we're looking at a game that's only retained around less than 1% of its all-time peak concurrent player numbers. They had missed the mark so much that just 2 weeks after the game's release on February 11th, 2026, the company called an all-hands-on meeting and told employees that most of them would be laid off because they just ran out of money. And a big part of that had to do with the fact that Tencent apparently pulled their funding on the studio when they saw that the metrics surrounding the game and its commercial performance were not meeting certain bars that they had to meet for Tencent to continue funding. The game apparently didn't even come close to achieving the results that Tencent was expecting. And so Tencent said, I'm out, and that's when the layoffs had to happen. The end result is that right now, less than 20 people remain at Wildlight, which is nowhere near enough people to make content at a scale and quality and consistent level of output that will allow a live service to thrive and to be properly maintained. This is very much a dead service at this point, one that is on a fast decline and is barely on life support. The remaining less than 20 people are continuing to update Highguard with the hope of salvaging the game and bring players back, but I just don't see that happening. Ain't no way. Which finally brings us to what multiple developers cited as the element that ultimately led to Wildlight's and Highguard's downfall. Bloomberg's article states right here that speaking to former developers, they use the word hubris, a belief by the company's leadership that they could emulate what had worked in the past with Apex Legends, no matter how much the gaming landscape had changed since then. After all, they'd made one of the last decade's biggest hits. Basically, this mentality of like, we made Apex Legends, we made Titanfall, we are untouchable. We just repeat Apex Legends strategy and all will work out because we are former Respawn developers. But again, there's a brand new studio with a brand new game making a brand new IP that isn't in line with games like Apex Legends and Titanfall that is set in a completely different universe, whose gameplay is pretty different and whose overall like aesthetics and everything look very different as well. To attempt this kind of strategy as a newcomer that has not proven anything is very much hubris. But at least apparently the working environment within Wildlight was described as healthy, collaborative, transparent, and made many love working there. That is until the last 2 months when morale started to tank, when people realized that success might not be guaranteed, no straight answers about what success would look like, leading staff to grumble that they might be approaching things the wrong way, which now we know in hindsight they absolutely did. And the end result is an unceremonious and tragic end to what was a valiant attempt. I have no doubt that the developers had every good intention to try to ship the best and most fun product possible based on their strengths as developers, but there were a number of strategic and marketing and game design mishaps, as well as this echo chamber effect and a lack of listening to certain developers who had the hindsight to be like, maybe we should put out a beta or something. Maybe we should take certain different approaches and not just try to emulate what we did with Apex Legends because the environment we're in is different from that. All of that ultimately contributed to a game that came and went almost as fast as Concord did. But yeah, I do hope that these developers do land on their feet somewhere else and that they succeed in their future endeavors. But when it comes to Wildlight and Highguard, just kind of came and then it went. And I just truly don't foresee any chance of a comeback. It take nothing short of a miracle, unfortunately. But that, folks, is everything you need to know about the latest surrounding Highguard and probably the last we'll ever hear of this title. I don't think there's really much more to say about this game. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on Highguard, its marketing, its launch, your experience if you play the game, and its post-launch in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.